everybody, and welcome to our first ever joint committee sponsored history forum on Somerset slavery and segregation. My name is Atsuko Horiguchi, and I will be your facilitator and moderator for the evening. I am joined by my lovely colleague, Paige Whitley, who is the chair of the History and Archives Committee, and I myself am the chair of the Equity and Inclusion Committee, both committees in the town of Somerset. And I apologize if I didn't get a chance to personally greet you as you entered the room, but we are so happy to be here. So I just wanted to introduce our two committees, which both of which were officially founded in 2021 at the height of the pandemic, both of which have a town council liaison in the person of Robin Barr. Thank you, Robin. And the Somerset History and Archives Committee has a twofold mandate. One is to gather and preserve historical materials of the town of Somerset, and the second is to educate the public. Its members are Paige, Donna, and Pat. Donna was the past chair, and Paige is the current chair. She's also the presenter for this evening. And I will read a little bio of her in just a moment. So the Somerset Equity and Inclusion Committee has a threefold mandate. One is awareness raising and education. Two is community building, and three is town policy change. This is in the way that the town is run, governance, and so forth, how the town business is conducted. And in all of these, we seek to introduce an equity and inclusion perspective. We have 9 members, and I am the current chair, and I hope there will be many to follow. So now I'm going to read Paige's bio. I'm sure this is just a tiny fraction of what she does, but Paige started exploring local history in 2016 with fellow resident David Cathan. Am I saying that right?
Yes.
When they delved into the history of nearby River Road. She hasn't stopped. Her research focuses on the people and communities of early African American settlements in Montgomery County and has been published in Washington History and presented at area history conferences. She and her husband have lived in Somerset since 1998. So without further ado, I am turning the virtual floor over to Paige, and over to you.
All right. I hope everybody can see my screen. I suggest you moderate your Zoom so that you can just see the screen. And if you want to see me, fine. I'd rather you didn't, but that's okay. Tonight's topic is Somerset slavery and segregation. And I do want to point out that this talk will review slavery and racism in our local history, and when quoted, employs racist terms not accepted today. But let's talk. Our town of Somerset institutional history tells of its roots starting in 1890, when businessmen entrepreneurs Bell and Walsh sold 50 acres of their 217-acre holding to 5 men who worked for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, who are included in this photo: Dr. Harvey Wiley, Dr. Daniel Salmon, Dr. Charles Crampton, Horace Horton, and Miles Fuller. These men established the Somerset Heights Colony Company and quickly planned a community not only for themselves, but to market for others as well. Advertisements began in earnest. The Evening Star touted, "The lots are to contain not less than 1 acre, with a view to ensuring the building of a cluster of villas, forming a suburb fashioned after the very pleasant ones of Boston and other northern cities." The first homes for these partners were completed in 1893, and all are now part of our town's historic district. But today I want to talk mostly about BS, that is, the history of the area before Somerset. This means talking about the pervasiveness of slavery in our county, the aftermath of the Civil War, and an insight into race relations at the time of our town's incorporation in 1906. Concerning the latter, I'm specifically going to summarize recent research documenting the attempt of a Black syndicate to create a nearby suburban development for African Americans, and the role both area white communities, including Somerset, and the Chevy Chase Land Company had in its demise. So let's begin. The basis of colonial Maryland's economy was initially a mix of slavery, indenture, and apprenticeship. But in 1664, a law was passed making Africans and their offspring slaves for life. Tobacco, the profitable New World product, was king. Its labor-intensive production was directly tied to growing levels of enslavement. It was currency, used as tax payments and required in contracts. Our nearby river road was what was called a rolling road and was used to bring tobacco from up county to High Street, what we know of as Wisconsin Avenue, the main road to Georgetown, and thus to the port there for shipment to the Old World. It would have been used by, for example, the Robert Peter family of Georgetown, think Tudor Place, who owned huge tracts of land producing tobacco near Seneca Quarry. Some of those enslaved there were originally enslaved by Martha Park Custis Washington, George Washington's wife. Travelers using this road may have stopped nearby at the Spinning Wheel Tavern for either food or a smithy. It was established around 1840 and was located near the intersection of what is now River Road and West Bard. It was demolished in the 1930s. At the time of independence, when Montgomery County came into being, Bethesda had only about 24 families. This old map shows the road out of Georgetown leading up to all the way to Frederick via Rockville here. This is Tenleytown area. If you had veered off here, you would have been on the old River Road, just a common noun then, paralleling the river, going to those up-county places I told you about, the rolling road. If you continued further, you would have made a little jag here and gotten on what we know of as the old Georgetown Road, an old dirt road that went off to Rockville. In 1818, a Washington and Rockville Turnpike Company was formed that started improving this road. And at that point, it straightened it out and went straight to Rockville here. And that's where we get our Rockville Pike today. The land out in Montgomery County was vast. Farms were hundreds of acres in some cases, built on land patents, quickly bought up by the movers and shakers of Georgetown when available around 1700. These men, these movers and shakers, had names like Peter, Dunlop, Addison, Fletchell, and Davidson. And the tracts had unusual names like Friendship, Brook Grove, and Clean Drinking. Enslavement of Africans was common in Montgomery County. Our county's most famous voice detailing slavery was Josiah Henson, who was enslaved by Isaac Riley of Rockville before eventually fleeing to Canada for freedom. The site where he was in the Riley place is now a museum located near the Shriver Aquatic Center. In his 1849 memoir, said to be inspiration for Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, he wrote, "Our lodging was in log cuts of a single small room with no other floor than the trodden earth. There were neither beds nor furniture of any description, a blanket being the only addition to the dress of the day for protection from the chillness of the air or the earth. In these hovels we were penned at night and fed by day. Here were the children born, and the sick neglected. Such were the provisions for the daily toil of the slave." We have an outsider's perspective of the region when Frances Trollope, an Englishwoman, visited Washington and the Potomac area in 1827. In her travelogue, she waxed eloquently on the natural wonder of the Great Falls, but she was critical of the slavery in the region. She observed this household somewhere near Potomac. Quote, "One of these families consisted of a young man, his wife, 2 children, a female slave, and 2 young lads, slaves also. The house was built of wood and looked as if the 3 slaves might have overturned it had they pushed hard against the gable end. It contained one room of about 12 feet square, and another adjoining it, hardly larger than a closet. Above these rooms was a loft without windows. Near this mansion was a shanty, a black hole, without any window, which served as kitchen and all other offices, and also as the lodging of the blacks." Statistically speaking, in 1810, Montgomery County's black population was at its highest in the 1800s, almost 46%. Yet only 8% of the black population were free, mostly living around the Quaker strongholds of Sandy Spring and Brookville. Oh, come on. Now this map is from 1865 and shows area landowners by name. Bethesda, even in 1865, was small, sleepy, and decidedly rural. The area had a toll booth as part of the Washington and Rockville Turnpike. It also had a blacksmith shop owned by one Richard Ball, said to be close to where the Courtyard Marriott is in Friendship Heights. And it had Darcy's store, which acted also as the post office and was the name for the region until 1862, when Bethesda was chosen. This is a close-up of our area. Again, where my arrow is, that is the Rockville Turnpike, running diagonally from Georgetown down here, up to Rockville and beyond to Frederick. We see the old river road forking off here from Tenleytown, paralleling the river and going up to Up County. And then we see the enslavers locally, and I'm going to talk about just a few. In the paper that David Cathan, I, and Amy Rispin wrote in 2016 in Washington History, we go into more detail about some of these if you're interested. Early on was Abraham Bradley over here, from whose name we get Bradley Boulevard. He was part of a contingent who moved to Washington, D.C. in 1800 when Philadelphia moved the capital from, when the capital moved from Philadelphia to Washington, D.C. This was his second home, his holiday summer retreat, etc., of more than 200 acres. But because of that overuse of tobacco, there was a huge land price fall in the 1830s and 40s, as many gave up because of the poor soil and searched for other areas in Kentucky and North Carolina and Missouri, for example. Into the region came some newcomers. We have, as you see here, Richard Williams, whose land became the basis of Somerset. We also had over here Nathan Loughborough, who bought the Milton estate in 1848 for his new bride, Harriet Dunlop Thomas. Nathan, like Abraham Bradley, had also come here when the capital moved, and he was the comptroller of the Treasury under John Adams. Next door to him was Peter Posey, who came here also in the 1830s from St. Mary's County. Samuel Councilman came in the 1830s, and these are his 2 sons, John Councilman here, whose land is more or less where Kenwood Country Club is, and his brother over here, whose land straddled Montgomery County and Northwest DC. And then we also had John Davidson, who was a wealthy merchant in Georgetown and bought a second place here in 1842. Also, like the Bradleys, as a secondary place. When these purchasers bought their properties, the deeds sometimes included more than just the land, as in the case for John Davidson, whose 1842 deed not only conveyed the 200 or plus acres, but also an existing estate and, quote, a Negro man named Baptiste, a Negro man named Ben, a Negro man named Horace, and the latter's wife and 2 children. But I want to talk about who was Richard Williams. And I've been preoccupied with trying to understand who was this mystery man upon whom our town is founded, whose land became the basis for our 50 acres. Forgive me for spending a little bit of time here because I'm anxious to share my information with you. Richard Williams was born around 1801, and by 1824 his mother was widowed, left with young adult Richard and his 3 sisters. In the 1830s, he became an administrator for the estate of Judge Thomas Cranfin. His job was to inventory all the assets of the 5 estates owned by Cranfin when he died at age 92 in December 1830. Now, Cranfin was one of Maryland's elite class. He was a colonial patriot and a respected and longtime judge of Montgomery County's Orphans Court. His death sparked litigation and a TMZ-worthy scandal of the time. He owned 5 plantations, totaling over 6,000 acres, and he employed nearly 250 enslaved people in his work. He was worth about $68,000 at the time of his death. Earlier, at the age of 75, he engaged in a relationship with Caroline Calvert, a woman enslaved by his neighbor and his friend, George Calvert, who happened to be Caroline's biological father. Cranfin and Caroline had 11 children, and he considered her his common-law wife. When Cranfin died, he left behind a complicated will, leaving to Caroline and her children a considerable estate. Legal maneuvers extended for decades as Cranfin's relatives cried wolf and tried very hard to overturn this will. Eventually, the heirs, the Calverts, and even Richard Williams was caught up for decades in this mess. And eventually, the heirs prevailed in court. Now, it's not clear what Richard did before becoming this inventory man for Judge Cranfin's estates, but it is clear that in the 1830s, he acquired the 11.5 acres that Somerset is derived from. And that land extended into Friendship Heights, down to River Road, and was big. He married local girl Julia Huddleston in 1844 and had 6 children. William Offutt, in his book Old Bethesda, describes a small 2-story frame house on this land, accessed via a pretty semicircular drive lined with pear trees. And Offutt should know the description. The youngest William's daughter, Betty, married an Offutt. I believe it's Bill's grandfather. Of the 6 children, 3 of them, Laura, Betty, and Clayton, moved to Section 5, Chevy Chase, in the 1880s, and that's where Williams Lane is, named after them. What is clear is that Richard Williams, like many of his nearby neighbors, enslaved people. Here we see 3 ads related to Williams. One placed over here when he was an administrator for Cranfin's estates, searching for 2 men, Joseph Bell and James Thomas. Here in 1838, as a personal enslaver, he is advertising for a young man named Ben who has run away. And over in here in 1843, we see an advertisement placed by the sheriff of Carroll County, saying in his possession, in his jail, was one Henry Davis, about 19 years of age, who says he belongs to Richard Williams, Montgomery County, Maryland. Now, 2 Marylands existed when the Civil War broke out. The northern points, where free labor formed the economy, and the Eastern Shore, heavily based on slave labor. Montgomery County was in between, with 38% of its population enslaved. Heavily anti-abolitionist, perhaps unsurprisingly, in the 1860 presidential election, Abraham Lincoln received only 2% of votes cast in Montgomery County, and those mostly cast in the Quaker community in Sandy Spring. At the 1860 census, the county had 770 enslavers, most of whom, 75%, having small holdings of 10 or less enslaved. Now, this trend was reflected locally. According to the 1860 slave census, Davidson enslaved 14 people, 7 of whom were aged 10 or younger. Harriet Loughborough enslaved 7, 2 of whom were children. Peter Posey enslaved 12 people, half of whom were children. And John Councilman enslaved 7, 2 of whom were children. Now, the Loughborough family was one of many divided families of the Civil War, with some fighting for the North, and James Henry Loughborough, Nathan's grandson, joining the Confederacy. But despite torn loyalties, especially here in southern leading Montgomery County, Maryland stayed in the Union. But our county's anti-abolitionist sentiment can be seen in an 1864 referendum when Montgomery residents voted 3-1 against a new state constitution that freed the slaves. The Constitution passed statewide, but barely. We glean more insight into the people of the area, both enslaved and enslaver, through the 1862 DC emancipation petitions and the 1868 Montgomery County slave statistics. So when Abe Lincoln emancipated slaves in DC in 1862, enslavers could petition a 3-man panel for reimbursement, for recompense. We see in the first example, Richard Williams' sister Elizabeth applying for recompense for an enslaved woman named Mary Carter and her 3 children, Lewis Carter, Andrew Green, and Georgiana Carter, as well as Jane Johnson and her 2 children. And again, she specifies that servant Mary Carter was bequeathed to me by the will of the late Thomas Cranfield. Elizabeth was based in DC, but Montgomery County residents, in some cases, also petitioned this DC panel. And we see that example in the second one, when Lucy Councilman, the daughter of nearby John Councilman, petitioned for recompense for the services of one Lucinda Martin, who had been working in Georgetown for the past few years. No, you know what? Lucinda Martin ended up marrying local blacksmith Nelson Wood in 1866. And by 1880, the 2 of them are located on River Road and are part of the African American community there called Graysville. And she's then known by the name Mary Ann Wood. 1868 Montgomery County slave statistics also attempted to record, but it was voluntary, the enslavers and those that they had enslaved at the date of that referendum, November 1864. We see below Ariana Williams, per Richard Williams, her agent and attorney, noting and listing Ruth Davis, age 35, and her 5 children ranging in age from 3 to 14. Notice over here who's attesting to her ownership. Well, her agent, her brother, Richard Williams, Greenberry Watkins, who was the largest enslaver in our local area, and up the street, Joseph Bradley, son of Abraham Bradley, who had inherited that property. Now, after the war, veterans came home, including newly enfranchised African American men who often became leaders in the new Black enclaves that sprung up. I don't have a picture, but William Henry Harrison Brown of Graysville served as a private in Company G of the 30th U.S. Colored Infantry Regiment. He was a longtime Graysville resident and a spiritual leader, being a lay preacher at Tenleytown's St. Mark's Methodist Church through the 1890s. John Godfrey, who you see on the left, was a private in Company F of the 1st U.S. Colored Infantry. He fled his enslavement in PG County and signed up under an alias, John Bowie. After the war, he ended up over here working on John Davidson's farm for 3 years before moving to the district. On the right here, you see James Henry Loughborough, who was a veteran, the grandson, I remind you, of Nathan Loughborough. He fought for the Confederacy in Virginia's 10th Cavalry, and he inherited Milton Estate and became Justice of the Peace for the district. As it turns out, I just recently discovered that his wife, Margaret Cable Brown Loughborough, was a member of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. Reconstruction was a period of adjustment for both former enslavers and the enslaved. The situation of an uneasy coexistence of opposites in our locale is best exemplified by pastors of 2 area churches. The Reverend James Averett, who you see on the left, was born on a huge tar plantation in North Carolina and served as chaplain for the Confederacy under Stonewall Jackson's Chief of Cavalry. In 1873, he became the first pastor of St. John's Episcopal Church of Norwood Parish, located nearby at the intersection of Bradley Boulevard and Wisconsin Avenue. His congregants included former enslavers like the Dodges, Davidsons, and Offits. In what some historians think was an attempt at revisionist history, in 1901, he wrote Old Plantation, How We Lived in the Great House and Cabin Before the War, which described the, quote, idyllic and harmonious life that both enslaved and enslavers enjoyed at his old home plantation. He was a staunch, unrepentant Confederate and lost cause promoter. In contrast were 2 spiritual leaders for the Graysville Black community. I've written about Georgetown-based itinerant preacher the Reverend Jacob Ross in an article published last fall by Washington History, outlining his enslaved life in Lexington, Virginia, his gaining of his family's freedom, and his spiritual and civic leadership in the greater Washington area to small Black communities sprouting up. He and Francis Gray are both mentioned in an 1875 article marking a cornerstone laying ceremony of a Graysville Independent Methodist Episcopal Mission Church. Quote, one of the leading spirits among the men of the color in this vicinity is Francis Gray, a local preacher of the IME Church. He was one of the first settlers in the vicinity and had the honor of having the village, a large part of which is owned by him, called by his name, Graysville. Sadly, apart from this one mention, there is no other documentary evidence thus far of this church. No land records exist for it, so it may have been planned on private land. Within months, the IME branch was soon subsumed into the African Methodist Episcopal Church, so it's likely that the church was never built. Graysville residents soon began attending newly emerging Baptist and Methodist churches in Tenleytown. In the late 1800s, Montgomery County's Slave Pass still peeked out in the landscape. Riding along nearby River Road, one might have seen the former slave cabins that served as homes to veteran William H. Brown, which was somewhere near McDonald's, or Henry Jackson, who had a place back behind the Kenwood Body Shop. Looking at the photo on the left, you might have spied this cabin belonging to African-American Pascal Botts, whose wife Eliza worked at some point for the Loughboroughs. Young Herbert Solium took this photo in 1895 on his parents' land, located near the corner of Willard Avenue and River Road. The structure strongly resembles a documented slave cabin on nearby Chevy Chase's no-gain property. I bless Herbert for being so meticulous and noting the date, his initials, the place, including the property name Untalfa that his father had named his land. I only wish he had also noted who is in the photo. On the right, we see what looks like a man in a bowler hat, and on the left, a young woman or a young person. We don't know. We can only guess. Terror also still stalked county Black communities. In the 1880s, newspapers reported the lynching of 2 African American men in Montgomery County. The last lynching in our county was in 1896 when Sidney Randolph was lynched in Rockville. Sarah Headland, archivist for Montgomery history, has written in detail about these lynchings. This map from 1904 shows 3 things that heavily influenced our area at the turn of the century. First, the introduction of nearby railway and trolley lines that moved goods and people in and out of the city. We have the B&O Railroad, the Metropolitan Southern B&O Railroad here, which is our Capitol Crescent Trail. We had the Glen Echo Electric Railroad moving east-west. And we also had the trolley from Georgetown that first came to the border, but then also continued on to Rockville. In addition to these modes of transportation opening up possibilities, in 1897, we had the establishment of the USDA's Experimental Station for Animal Husbandry. This is where our guys from Somerset were working. But not only they worked there. In fact, at the turn of the century, a lot of heads of households from the Graysville community went up via the railroad path to work there at the station. The third thing we see on this map are these little blue grids. See these? This is suburban development spreading to the area. Over here we have Chevy Chase, the premier development of the Chevy Chase Land Company, which had been buying up land north of north of DuPont Circle, and this was their premier development, as I said. And we also see Somerset here in the center. In 1900, there were only a handful of families living in Somerset. A few African Americans, like 5 of them, were employed in different households as servants. But these developments, basically, Somerset and Chevy Chase were offering a dream to buyers escaping the city. Not only did they purchase land, but they also purchased homes and infrastructure, or at least that's what was promised. In 1905, Somerset consisted, in this portion, of 35 residences. But the Civic Association was overwhelmed in trying to keep up infrastructure like wooden sidewalks. It was said that only a third of the association members actually made contributions. Residents petitioned to become a town so it could levy taxes to provide for essential services. The town was chartered in 1906 and held elections for mayor and council in May. The first council meeting was held on May 14th, and Mr. Elbert Richmond was appointed marshal of the town. It seems Mr. Richmond's main tasks were to mostly enforce rules about dogs running around wild and making sure the boardwalks were repaired. Into this mix came the desire of one group of men to build a nearby Black suburban development called Belmont. What I share now, with their permission, is a summary of the excellent recent research called Belmont, the Lost Plan for a Black Chevy Chase, done by Neil Flanagan and Kimberly Bender. I highly recommend that you view their 28-minute video posted on YouTube. Almost a month after the town of Somerset's first council session in mid-May, on June 16, 1906, 4 African-American businessmen from Washington, D.C. formed the Belmont Syndicate with the goal of developing an elite suburb for African Americans located along Wisconsin Avenue between Chevy Chase and Somerset and Friendship Heights. The syndicate was led by businessman Alexander L. Satterwhite. On June 28th, using a white buyer as an intermediary, the syndicate successfully bought 30 acres from a subsidiary of the Chevy Chase Land Company, the latter founded by powerful Senator Francis Newlands, an avowed white supremacist. And we see here the outline of Belmont. Advertisements for Belmont quickly appeared in both white newspapers and black ones, like the Washington Bee. A post ad proclaimed that Belmont, quote, was the only good subdivision in Washington where colored people are welcome to buy. Flanagan and Bender identify at least 28 African Americans who bought lots, including a Methodist preacher, a Civil War vet, multiple single women, and connected members of DC's black elite. But neighboring white communities were aghast and quickly grew incendiary. Threats of violence were made. The whitecaps mentioned here in this title, that's a reference to the KKK. Satterwhite's response was, quote, the plan is to establish a first-class suburb where colored people of Washington, who can afford to do so, may build and own their own homes. Of course, there is no desire to affect anyone living in the vicinity, but if they are offended, that cannot be helped. An outspoken critic to Belmont was architect Richard O. in Friendship Heights. In one article, he was quoted as saying, quote, to establish a Negro colony at Belmont, practically at our doors and beyond the restraint of the district police force, would mean the impairment of our property values, a constant menace to our peace and security, and the destruction of the happiness of our homes. Things came to a head on Sunday, July 22nd, when our very own Marshal of Somerset arrested Satterwhite and brought him to Justice of the Peace Loughborough's porch at the Milton Estate off River Road. There, Satterwhite, flanked by loyal friends, was charged with selling land without a real estate license, having a penalty of up to the astronomical $30,000 fine. He was acquitted, but as he left, Deputy Sheriff Councilman raced after him to arrest him a second time, this time for selling on a Sunday. Again, Satterwhite was acquitted. I'd like to say Belmont continued to sell lots and was a success. Lots did continue to be sold for a while, but then, as detailed by Flanagan and Bender, the Chevy Chase Land Company began to use financing tools to stall sales until the Belmont Syndicate ran out of money. Satterwhite stuck, sold his shares of the syndicate to a white speculator, prompting Michel Dumas, another syndicate member, to file a lawsuit against nearly everybody involved. After the land company's affiliate foreclosed on almost all the Belmont land, it was unable to reach an agreement with Dumas, and so litigation dragged for another 15 years, by which time Dumas was a trustee of Howard University. Finally, in 1926, the land company erased the legal subdivision of Belmont and incorporated what you see here, a thin strip of land to buffer Chevy Chase from Wisconsin Avenue. The only thing that remained of Belmont is a short section here named Belmont Street. Flanagan and Bender go into great detail describing various ostensibly racially neutral practices that were used to discriminate against marginalized groups in the development of suburbia. Ironically, racial covenants were rarely used. To date, I haven't found one on a Somerset land deed. The bottom example here does show a 1929 racial covenant from nearby Kenwood. Such covenants were actually legal from 1928 to 1948. More subtle were restrictive covenants, like the example on top for the Callahan property before it was formally part of Somerset. It's basically where Somerset Elementary School is now. This deed had the following restrictions, and I'll read them because they're not easy to see. Quote, that no wine, beer, malt, or spirituous liquor shall be manufactured or sold on any parts of the lots, nor any stable or buildings for use of horses, cattle, or livestock be erected, except for private stables, of course. No slaughterhouse or manufacturing shall be erected thereon. And links to Somerset? Well, it's unclear why the Marshal of Somerset arrested Satterwhite. The town council meeting records no mention of Belmont at all in summer of 1906. But it turns out that Richard O., the vocal opponent to Belmont, was the father of one William Alpheus, known as Alf O., who not only served as one of the first Town of Somerset council members in 1906, but with his father Richard built many of the four-square homes in Somerset on spec for developer Edward Halliday around 1901. The 1910 census on the left shows him on Cumberland Avenue. And his next-door neighbor, believe it or not, Town Marshal Elbert Richmond. Further up the street, future mayors Charles Moore and Warren Biggs. I want to conclude this talk with statistics that hit me every time I view them. If you look at the last two lines in the upper chart, you will see that Montgomery County's African American population dropped from 33% in 1900 to 6% in 1950. Today, our county is much more diverse. Now, I realize tonight's talk has covered a lot of ground, a lot of history, and it's my hope that you've gained a few insights into our area's past. And I want to make a plug. If you are itching to dig into our past further, please contact the History and Archives Committee at historyandarchives@townofsomerset.gov to become a volunteer researcher. Lastly, you can view Neil Flanagan and Kimberly Bender's video, Belmont, The Lost Plan for a Black Chevy Chase on YouTube, and I highly recommend it. Atsuko, hopefully you can now share some of the questions posted in the chat, and then hopefully we'll break out into discussion sessions. So I will stop sharing. There we go.
Thank you so much, Paige. Wow, there was so much.
Everybody go like that.
We have a bunch of questions. So I'm going to start at the top. And as Leslie Kaplan said, I shared the link for the Belmont video, but it will be in the town journal, accessible to everybody. So I highly recommend it. It is just eye-opening. Okay, so first question. Did the name Belmont have some special significance in its name origin?
You know what? I don't know. And I don't think Neil Flanagan or Kimberly Bender mentioned its origin as well.
Okay,
I'm sorry, I can't answer that one.
that's fine. Next is, did enslaved persons live in what is now the town of Somerset?
Okay, so that I can somewhat refer to. Town of Somerset is 50 acres of that larger 211 and a half. So I can't tell you pinpointing exactly where. But we do have clues that Richard Williams was enslaving various persons on this property. I didn't go into great detail. Because of that huge legal case involving Thomas Crampton and his heirs and his executor, the Calverts, and then Richard Warren himself getting drawn into it, he started having trusts with and exchanges of property to his sisters, and one mentions an enslaved man named David. We see in the 1868 Montgomery County slave statistics that Ariana per Richard is applying for enslaved people, a woman named Ruth Davis, and her 5 children. And I've gone on to trace her. Ruth Davis is married to a William, and they and their children actually, after that 1868 slave statistic, we see them living near the Abraham Bradley land on Bradley Boulevard, and they're there for at least 2 decades or so. They also end up having land on Broad Branch Road and are somehow related to the community in Tenleytown in Rita City. So I'm going off into tangents, but I love knowing about people and bringing them to life, that they're not just names and that they're not just forgotten. So we know at least a few enslaved people were on the greater property that was Richard Williams' land.
Thank you, Paige. So next comment I feel is and question is a big one. So I might park the second part to it's part of the group discussion prompting question, but so outstanding presentation. Do you have any recommendations on what Somerset can do to address this past? If you have any,
I think
and that's, I think, a
actually,
topic for further discussion,
I think
obviously.
a lot of further discussion as well as further research. So for example, all this stuff about Belmont is eye-opening to me, as to many in Northwest DC, that we had no idea this happened and that it did, and what role do citizens have in that. I'd like to learn more about that. What's interesting to me is that Francis Newlands, who started the Chevy Chase Land Company and got his money out west in California and in Nevada, he worked in banking in San Francisco. And at the same time, or roughly, Richard O., that guy who was protesting Belmont, was literally designing the institutions and town of Oakland, California. And I can't help wondering, people rubbing shoulders. You know, how do people make connections? The same as the movers and shakers of Georgetown, who owned so much property and had so much wealth, and also much of it derived through enslaved labor. I don't know. For me, I just want to keep learning more about it. I hope others do too.
Thank you. So the Belmont Strip is where Saks Fifth Avenue and the parking lots are today?
Pretty much, pretty much. And actually including Saks Fifth Avenue. If you go behind that parking lot, there's a tiny road named Belmont.
Okay. Do we know, next question, do we know anything of the family background of the original founders of Somerset? Were any from families who had held slaves?
I don't know the answer to that question. I have a feeling no. And Donna Harmon, who has done a fabulous job doing a presentation in 2019 on the origins and house histories, etc., of Somerset as a town, may answer. My impression, looking at the early founders of Somerset, are these USDA scientists were not local boys. You know, some came from Indiana, some came from other states. They came to Washington, D.C. as scientists to work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture, I think. And hopefully Donna can correct me if I'm wrong.
Is Donna, I think you are here if you want to unmute and chime in. I also don't want to put you on the
I'm
spot.
pretty sure these were, there wasn't, these were small groups, small people, and so they wouldn't have had slaves generally. Certainly at that point, they wouldn't have. These were all just small households with, you know, a couple children. So
Right.
I think it changed things.
Yeah. And I don't think they grew up. I don't think the founders grew up in Washington, D.C. or
No,
in
most
this
of them
area.
didn't.
They came from elsewhere. So hey, more research, yay.
Thank you, Donna. Thank you, Claire. Next question. Thank you so much, Paige. I'm wondering when racial covenants became illegal in both DC and Montgomery County.
So my understanding from reading and from Neil Flanagan and Kimberly Bender is that racial covenants in the US were legal from 1928 to 1948. But they came about as early as the 1840s. You can see racial covenants in the country in different locations. Bender and Flanagan basically say the Chevy Chase Land Company didn't use them because they knew that they were kind of illegal. So they just used other more subtle means to squash things and have things go their way.
Okay, I see some hands being raised. I'm sorry, but for this evening's purposes, can you please type in the questions into the chat? Okay, next question. Have there been any gatherings of descendants of enslavers with descendants of people whom they enslaved?
I have not come across any mentioning of such in my research. That does not mean there haven't been. I don't know the answer. I'm sorry. Good question. Interesting.
So this is, I'm going to name David Cathan said, a fantastic
Yay.
presentation, Paige. You have found so much more since 2016, when I guess you two were digging into this. First question is, where was the Williams house? And second question, should we work on getting Bradley Lane, Bradley Boulevard, and Davidson Street renamed?
Okay, so first about the Williams house, and this pertains to lots of things. I wish I had the skill to superimpose old maps on current maps and using the degrees laid out on old deeds to map out exactly where borders and such are. I do not have that knowledge or skill base, but if somebody wanted to join and do that, we could possibly learn where the Williams home was, as well as a variety of other things in the area based on those older maps. In terms of working on changing names, I'm brought to Brian Stevenson's phrase that each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done. I'm not sure about changing names willy-nilly. Each of these families that I've mentioned as enslavers are more than just enslavers. What they are, I don't know completely. But I think of that line, each of us is more than the worst thing we've ever done, a lot in doing this research.
Thank you. Next one. There was a Rosenwald School on River Road before 1930. Did Somerset support it?
Good question. Of necessity, I had to make a cutoff at some point and not continue until Brown versus Board of Education and the Civil Rights Act, later. Somerset Elementary School came about in 1928. It was during the period that the River Road School was set up, and they were parallel black and white educational systems set up by the Board of Education for Montgomery County. It was segregated until Brown versus Board of Education. Whether Somerset supported it or not, I have not in any of the news blurbs that I've come across seen any mention of names that I associate with Somerset. Pat Barry has done a lot of history on later Somerset elementary school history, and Zola Schneider has anecdotes about the early days of integration and some of the stories there that we should do a better job recording and saving for our town's history.
Thank you. Next question. How publicly accountable has the Chevy Chase Land Company been to their actions and past policies?
I have no idea, but I would like to know. Who wrote that? Let's start.
Okay. Next question. Do you have any information about the accession of the River Road Black community into Somerset School? And thank you for your wonderful perspectives.
Again, that's something that we can do more about. The anecdote that has been told to me, and Zola, please forgive me if I get this wrong. And actually, it's not from Zola, but a family member. Remembering being in a classroom with two young African American students and a white teacher screaming at a young Black child for daring to use a crayon after school while waiting for a sibling. Something like that, very disturbing.
Okay. Superb presentation. If Chevy Chase and Somerset were initially meant to be properties of 1 acre, then Somerset was not meant to be an agricultural area, was it? Would that explain the number of slaves?
So remember, we're talking about two different periods of time. So the enslavement period is up to the Civil War and during the Civil War, and then afterwards, no more slaves. And so, as mentioned, during this time period, in the 1880s and 90s, all of these big, huge land areas, the Councilman Farm, the Bradley Farm, Williams Farm, etc., they were just bought up and broken up, mostly by speculators. And you can see in the land deeds, boom, 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 they're buying and selling over and over. No slaves at the turn of the century. It's all mid-century and before. But so the 1 acre thing for Somerset, that was one of the lures in its promotion, to be an area that was to be villa-like, like North Boston and other places, to give people the dream. Okay, in the old days, you bought a piece of land and then it was your problem setting up a house and whatever else. During this time of development, the dream was not only your property, but also they were gonna get you houses built, they were gonna promise water, electricity perhaps, and other infrastructure amenities.
Okay, thank you so much. That seems to be the end of, the questions, unless anybody else has any, if you can drop into the chat. But we might be able to come back to it after our small group discussions. And so I'm going to share screen again. So we're going into small group discussions, and please don't shy away and please don't leave the room now. Okay, well, thank you for sticking with the process until the very end. So without attribution, would anybody care to share what struck you most about these discussions in your small groups?
I will share.
Yes,
largely because what struck us is that we want to have more discussions like this. There wasn't any one particular item of sharing. It was the process of sharing and talking and thinking about a topic where none of us really think a lot about, because we feel like we're so far from the enslaved area. So I would say to have somehow more groupings like this over topics that are of interest.
Wonderful. We hope to do more. Fayez from our own committee.
Yeah, I don't think we explicitly discussed that, but if I could just extrapolate from the discussion we had, it was a very lively discussion. We didn't finish it, but there's clearly a great fascination with just understanding, the physical space in which we live and its origins, and what was the history behind it, and that could be salutary. And I'm going to offer up Paige to the larger group, which she did to the smaller group, to sort of give us guidance, maybe through the town announcements, as to how you can actually check the deeds of your particular property to see what the history is. And I think that might be interesting. I think we didn't really finish the discussion, but I think we felt that we'd moved on from inclusivity, in the narrower sense that it was understood, 50, 100 years ago. But we still are probably not diverse, and that's probably because we are exclusive in terms of the economics and who can afford to live in Somerset. And we just started the discussion on, the master plan and multi-family dwellings on existing lots, which had reached a very interesting point when we got cut off. But clearly, I think there is also an important discussion to be had there, probably is in a different forum, because that is a separate subject for the town, as to how do we view exclusivity now, rather than how do we view it through the lens of what exclusivity meant 50 years ago or 100 years ago.
Any other groups or would like to share about what struck you most about the conversations, or what struck you most about the presentation that you shared with each other? Leslie.
Yeah, we didn't stick to the questions.
All right.
But we spent a fair amount of time talking about what it's been like to, two of us have lived in Somerset since the 90s. Well, yeah, since the 90s, and raised kids here. And we spent some time talking about what it's like to be in the community and what it's been like to be not just in Somerset and elementary, but in Westland and BCC if you did public school. And Somerset was, I think, whiter than, like my son's now 33, just had his second kid, but it was whiter then. And we also spent some time talking about the sort of smugness that exists. Nobody used that word. I just used that word. But I think that's what we were talking about, of thinking that you live in a really liberal, progressive town, and the irony of it being not as diverse as the kinds of values you espouse. I think that's really a tricky thing about living in Somerset, actually.
Other comments about what struck you about the conversation and the presentation?
I mean, we just had a pretty similar, it was it seemed a very short time that we were in the breakout rooms. I thought, thank you, Paige, the presentation was phenomenal and sparked a lot of interest, and I think a lot of further conversations, and I think we should, definitely continue with this.
How about the question about inclusion and exclusion today? Did anything strike you about that conversation? If any of you stuck at all to the...
We also ventured into the whole Thrive initiative, and the question of single family zoning being one of the things that was used legally to segregate. The impact of it was to segregate neighborhoods and create segregated neighborhoods. And the irony that now it's, well, the irony that one of the vehicles for mitigating that kind of at least economic and then hopefully racial segregation is the Thrive initiative for the county, and what we're going to do about it in terms of our own lives and how we think it impacts our universe versus the greater good, I think. So
these are questions that we've been wrestling with at the committee, and we hope to have greater dialogue about this. David, I think you raised your hand.
Yes, thank you, Atsuko, and thank you everyone for being here. This is so stimulating, and my small group was also very stimulating. And I think that Paige's presentation hit me hard to see and feel in details and facts and images the racial history of all the places right around town, right around, you know, our neighborhoods, and how they have been part of slavery and segregation for many, many, many years. And so we did talk about inclusion and exclusion. And in my group, a distinction was drawn between economic inclusion of lower income people, and that seemed to not get universal support for a place like Somerset. But there seemed to be more of a consensus for inclusion of other kinds of diversity in Somerset, racial, ethnic, LGBTQ, etc., other types of diversity, and more of a need to actively promote and make Somerset a place for those kinds of diversity to be more welcome.
Elaborate a little bit, David, about the discussion around economic diversity?
I don't know. I guess some other speakers here have alluded to the Thrive Initiative as one way in which Somerset, as its character of single-family housing, would be transformed, and some degree of more economic diversity introduced. And as I think most of us who've been alert to conversations within town about that know, there are, you know, various perspectives, pro and con, and in between, perhaps, on those issues.
David?
Yeah, go ahead.
You know, it's funny.
Caroline.
It's from the tone of Sarah, and we didn't talk about that in ours. I mean, we had a great conversation, but and Paige, you did a fabulous job. But I mean, that's just a no-brainer. That's going to just blow this town apart, possibly. I mean, it's going to, if, you know, depending on how fast it moves, I mean, this could drag on forever and it could be a nothing. But if it really comes down hard, and there are, like, you know, people start building like three, I don't know what. I mean, I'm not taking a stand here. I'm really not. It's very tough. But I can see what it seems to me you're saying. People were saying, gee, we want a lot of diversity, but not economic diversity. I mean, this is how much the house costs. It's a single family house. This is how it's zoned. But I think it's going to be interesting because, you know, this is like a plan that is so much bigger than Somerset. It's so much bigger than Somerset. It's you know, it has got incredible intellectual backing by that. Who did that huge report that came out that just said this is really some of the major roots of segregation? I mean, without a doubt. Anyway, I've said enough. But I think it's going to be, you know, depending on how it plays out around us, I think it's going to be a very big issue.
Paige, do you know which report?
I think she's talking about a Thrive report, so I
Okay.
don't know.
No, it wasn't actually a Thrive report page. It was a report, and I'll try to look it up. Oh, I know, you know what? Because I just thought, you know, I'm not going to get near this, but I did. I actually can, I think, look at my sent because I put it on the listserv. All I did was put the report on. I just said, here's the report. And because I've seen it in this, you know, in the newsletter, I just thought you might be interested. So I'll try to find it.
Okay,
And I'll put it on the listserv again.
thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you, Joan. David, you have your hand up.
Yeah, I just wanted to bring a little bit of reality. I'm not making any point or any position on Thrive, but they're talking, you know, what we may see is perhaps 2 or 3 units or townhomes put on some half-acre lots. And most likely they will be probably priced around 700,000 or 1.2 in that range. So I personally don't think we're talking about any major difference in the economic diversity. It still is going to be an exclusive community, just more dense. So I don't think we're looking at any major change on that, but that's
interesting. Have you been like following it with the Thrive people or something?
I have not.
Oh, okay. I was just wondering.
Okay. Other people who would like to share any insights from the presentation, the discussion, the whole evening? We're going to start to wrap up. Okay, Caroline and then Kabir.
We didn't have a lot of chance to get into these issues in depth, but as we talked, it made me think a lot about diversity in the driving force in the 40 years that I've lived in Somerset, I think has been economic diversity. And when we moved here, and maybe, I wasn't sensitive to it, but it seemed like there was a lot more homogeneity in the community. And now I sense a lot of the schisms between the big developed houses and those who live in the smaller houses or the smaller areas. And I'm not sure if that is driving diversity more than, racial or other issues. And I think it's important to get into it. And it just made me think, a number of years ago, there was this big effort to make sure the Bergdahl tract was de-annexed from Somerset. And I can't remember all the issues, but it seems like maybe that's kind of a resurgence of Thrive, even though obviously the Somerset house is by no means low-income housing, but there was just a great concern that not be part of Somerset. Somerset was different. And I think maybe going back to some of those issues and also looking at where we are now, because it's fine to have a diversity of types of houses and prices and all of that, but what does it do to our values? And I think that's really the important thing from my perspective.
Thank you, Caroline. Paige, did you have something about that recent history of the de-annexation?
The wonderful team of Donna Harmon, Pat Barry, and I spent weeks last summer going through voluminous amounts of materials trying to decide what to be saved for Somerset archives and whatnot. And there's a lot of material of that. Somerset has been at constant forefront to preserve a green space and to preserve a town community and be anti-development on its footsteps, basically. And the Bergdahl stuff is part of that material that has been saved. That's all I'll say at this point.
Okay, thank you. So last question to Kabir, and then we're going to wrap up for this evening.
Thank you, Atsuko, and thank you so much, Paige. So I wanted to play back a couple of things from our group. By the way, I'm sorry I'm not on video after all day being on a Zoom call where you inadvertently just stare back at yourself. I decided to give myself a break. All of us express deep gratitude for Paige's work. And one of the things that came up in our discussion was to make sure that our town website, our town publications are updated with our evolving, understanding of our history. And I think that, this is some of this, a lot of this, in fact, remains absent from at least the public records that we have about our history. And so the more work we can do to do that could potentially go a long way in changing the conversation in our town. And the other thing that we talked about, and something that's been on my mind, I joined the council last year, and I have to say I was surprised to learn that I was the first person of color, the 100-year history of our town on the council. And, the last slide Paige showed I mean, seriously, it was, my wife was in the swim team and we wanted volunteers for the council. And so that's how I ended up on the council. It wasn't to be the first person of color on the council. So I think that reflects, some of the troubled underpinnings of our town. And, I think we have a lot of work to do to change the direction of our town. And that's what I'm learning as I've been on the council, that there's a lot below the surface. And despite our best intentions, there's a lot of work that needs to be done. So a baby step would be to openly acknowledge this history, to frequently talk about it, to make sure it's on our website, to make sure it's in our publications, to retire some of the history that is whitewashed, frankly. And I think that would go a long way evolving our town.
Thank you, Kabir. I think that's a lovely wrap up to the evening. Paige, do you have any last words before we close out? Thank you so
Yeah.
much for your incredible work.
Well, thank you everybody for your kind comments. I just want to remind people again, history is made up of humans. We are humans, and we are a mix of good and bad. That's all I can say. And so I want to just recognize it. We've got terrible parts in our history, good parts in our history, but it's never 100% all. And so, Kabir, I think that your comments about what I hope this evening is not revising history, but adding to it, filling in the gaps that have been there and that need to be filled in. That's what I look at this up to be, and that your comments of acknowledging some of this that had formerly not been known and or acknowledged is just filling in the gaps of history. That's all I want.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much, Paige. And thank you to everybody who remained engaged throughout the evening. And thank you everybody who left but listened to the presentation. I think this is just the beginning of an ongoing conversation. So thank you very much.